Oh, I
All
think you mean
right.
for the host.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, it's one or the other. This account somehow doesn't let us do co-hosts, and which is strange.
Oh, wow.
So I'm passing it back to you, Josh.
okay. Did you record it
Yeah, I
or
hit
start the
record.
recording?
I see. Yeah,
Perfect.
it's recording now. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Also, my problem is that the Zoom I have is in Russian, and so I'm trying to figure out where the functions are, and sometimes it's more successful than at other times. So, um, yeah. So, why is it in Russian? Because just as a little introduction to me, I've been living and working in the former Soviet Union for the past 7 to 8 years. So I have, yeah, mostly in Russia, also Ukraine and in the Balkans. I started getting involved with peace building and dialogue work kind of through conversations that I was having with people over there. I'm also, as you see in one picture, a big fan of hitchhiking. And also that was for me was this very kind of intense period of, yeah, just sitting with people with very different opinions and listening to different narratives. And that really kind of sparked in me a, yeah, a desire to kind of do more work in this area. So I'm originally from Canada, but yeah, I've been living abroad for most of the last decade. And as the war kind of started in Ukraine, also kind of like a lot of things kind of escalated after that and started getting more involved with dialogue in that context. And so actually me and some colleagues were doing research on how to evaluate dialogue initiatives for just because it's hard to look, it's hard to know what the results are. And especially when there's lots of donors that are trying to spend money on buzzwords, and dialogue is a big buzzword right now. So we're trying to make sure that it's seen as a legitimate practice and how we can prove that to people with budgets who can continue funding wonderful projects. So first, very, very briefly, in terms of you guys, maybe 2 or 3 people can shout out why are you interested in dialogue? Um, is this just because it's like a required course? Is this something you chose by yourselves? But also, what do you think like what kind of connection is there between a concept like dialogue and people's needs and safety as well? So anybody can just kind of shout out whatever reflection they have on that. And say your name also at first and maybe where you're from.
If you don't mind, I'll go first. My name is Vincent DeRocher.
Mhm.
And actually, I wanted for the last few semesters, I wanted to take this course, but for some reason I couldn't take it because of it clashed with my other courses. So I've been wanting to take this course for a while. So yeah, at first when I took it, I thought it was gonna be like something that could help me speak with people, right?
Mhm.
Basically, like communicate. But it turned out it's something pretty different. But I'm still really interested about it because, well, I mean, I want to become a police officer, right?
Mhm.
And in my mind, I mean, I'm gonna have to start as a patrol officer, but eventually I might be able to go into like mediator or negotiator, or maybe work with like youths or stuff like that. So I think dialogue is a really great tool to, well, from what I've learned, basically like put people on the same page, right? On the same, and basically so yeah, that's basically it. And for you, what's connection between dialogue and needs and safety? Well, like I said, dialogue is basically like more advanced communication, right?
Mhm.
So with dialogue, I hope that that it can help me understand other people, help other people understand each other, and that way they have like an easier. They don't have to spend as much time basically like arguing and fighting for their needs and their safety. They can
Mhm.
understand each other, and they basically like they already have more empathy with each other if
Mhm.
they spoke for a while. So yeah, that's me.
Perfect. So yeah, you said a number of great things there. So like dialogue as a way to generate empathy, also dialogue as a way to kind of address the different needs and say and like the safety of the different people involved. Yep, those are great. Anyone else would like to add something to the picture?
I guess I'll go. My name's Lisa, and I'm back at school after being away from studies for a while. So I'm actually quite intrigued with this course in dialogue and just helping people to learn how to create a safe environment and just have that sharing and open dialogue. Um, where my focus is, where I'm really interested in is healing, is particularly spiritual healing. And I just think that it's so important that um, people be able to listen and hear each other in order to be able to move forward and not be hanging on to the past with a lot of hurt. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. So yeah, some more great words: creating safe environments, letting go of hurt, mutual listening, spiritual healing. Thank you, Lisa. One more, if there's anybody else who would like to contribute.
I can go. It's Christina. And for me, dialogue is something that interests me because I work in the field of human resources. And when you're dealing with people and, you know, different kinds of challenges, I've been able to see how important it is to talk and to try to understand different people's perspectives, and that it can reduce the number of conflicts, and it can actually improve working relations and improve a workplace tremendously. So that's my interest.
And so what would you say, like, might be the connection between dialogue, the kind of dialogue that might reduce conflict and improve workplace relations, and concepts like needs and safety?
Well, I'll start with needs. From what I've observed, if let's say you have two people who are in a conflict, if in the workplace, if the other person isn't able to listen and be open to someone else's perspective, then the chances of resolution is very, very low. So it's having the other person feel that the other person who they're in conflict with is listening, and then your needs, you feel heard. So I would say that's part of the needs. In terms of safety, when people feel heard, you don't have to agree with them, but from what I've seen, then they do feel safe.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And I would also include, in, like, along with feeling heard, feeling visible as a way to generate safety. Great. So thanks everybody. So yeah, I definitely agree with all of these things. These are all things a dialogue can do. And these are all kind of examples of how we frame dialogue as something that can help meet people's needs and help create a space of safety. But what I would like to talk about today is in what cases might dialogue be seen as a threat to specific needs and a threat to specific people's safety. And what can we do as practitioners or as people who are invested in dialogue to work with that? Like, is this a narrative that some people have? Is this because there have been negative experiences of dialogue before? So in cases where people perceive dialogue itself as a threat, what can we do? So before we get into that, one thing I'd like us to think about is like just what kind of conflicts do we find ourselves in on a regular basis? So Christina was talking about workplace conflicts. I think it was Christina. And Lisa, if I remember correctly, she was talking about kind of more spiritual healing, which might be kind of conflict with oneself. Vincent was talking about conflicts that might be inherent in police work. So like what other kinds of conflicts do you guys like? What kinds of conflict appear in your lives on a regular basis? And anyone can just shout whether you spoke before or didn't speak before.
I can also monitor the chat if you want to put it in the chat box there.
Perfect. Yeah, I won't be able to see the chat right now.
That's okay.
Someone else can. Thank you.
Sorry, I interrupted somebody.
I was just gonna say, like, within families, there can be, I don't know if that captures it, what you're after, but like interpersonal relationships in families can be a huge source of conflict.
Great. Yeah, and this is something that like everybody finds themselves in as well. So like the kind of conflicts I work with, like they're kind of more like political or kind of like large group social, but like those that like it doesn't have to just be something like that for dialogue to be involved on a certain level. So personal relationships, families, workplace, what else? What other areas do you find yourselves in conflict at times?
So in the chat, we've got conflict of values,
Mm-hmm.
ideological conflicts,
Mm-hmm.
religious conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
And like gender conflict.
Resources conflicts, as in when there aren't enough resources, I think. Denis and Shauna, you're on the same page, I think.
Perfect. Yeah, and like a lot of these are like types of conflict as well. So it's like I see everyone was paying attention in conflict studies 101, all the different types. Perfect. Yeah. So in all of these different types, like for example, whether it's religious or gender or resource based, these can happen on a level of like individual people, but it can also happen on a level of like state versus state, right? So like these are all very applicable for different contexts. So in terms of these kinds of conflicts, how like how generally in your mind should they be solved? Like in terms of the strategy, what needs to happen to solve these kinds of conflicts, like resource conflicts, interpersonal conflicts, like what? And this is just this is obviously like a very broad question, but like for example, there are like religious conflicts. It could be either segregation, or it could be like negotiation. It could be domination. You know, like these different kinds of strategies. So what strategies can be used to resolve the conflicts that you guys find yourselves in?
Christine is offering mediation.
Mediation, yeah.
Socialism, says Shauna.
Socialism. So,
Negotiation.
Shauna, could you clarify what you mean by socialism as a way to resolve
So Shauna, if you want to drop it in the chat box, there was, who was that? Evelyn, I think you wanted to say something.
Negotiation.
Negotiation. How do you spell it? Oh my gosh, I have terrible spelling.
Arbitration, everybody's
Yeah,
favorite.
No judging, no judging.
terrible. I'm a writer too. This is like, that's like eternal shame upon me.
Denis says active listening, and Valentine says listening to each other, common ground.
So these are all really great. I would say that a lot of these strategies have to do with engagement, like engaging the other in a certain way, but there's also another kind, like there's obviously a lot of other kinds. So for example, in some cases, we might need to defend our boundaries, right?
Avoid.
Especially avoidance. It could be like a victory. Like if we see some kind of injustice, for example, and we want to like, or somebody says something inappropriate or discriminatory, we want to like go in and say, this isn't okay. So correction. So
I'm gonna offer the specificity from Shauna. So mostly just sharing resources, having a common good, common goal, prioritizes the individual and collective needs. Often for socialism to work properly, lots of what has been said would go into it, like finding common ground. We also have arbitration as a way of dealing with it, with conflict, and counseling.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, these are all good examples, and they're all true. One thing that I'm sure you guys have heard about in some of your other conflict classes, let me know if not, that there are different kinds of peace. Have you guys ever heard about the 2 different types of peace in other classes, this one or others, and what they might be? The pictures are a big clue. I'm very sorry for being obvious, if it's obvious, but 2 different types of peace.
Kayla's like, yep, negative peace and positive peace.
Oh, baby, yes. Okay, so negative peace and positive peace. Who can give me a definition of what these guys mean in a nutshell?
Oh my gosh, it's been a long time.
So yeah, it's been a while for me too. But if I remember correctly,
Uh-huh.
negative peace is just the end of the conflict, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is a 2 sides stop fighting, and that's pretty much it. Whereas a positive peace, the 2 sides kind of like start working together to like build themselves back up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, I don't know if that's a good example, but I'm thinking at the end of World War One,
Mhm.
where the Germans were basically forced to pay for other people for the other country's damages, and they didn't have any military. They had like sanctions on like I don't know the details, but to me that would be an example of negative peace.
Mhm.
Whereas yeah, I don't really know any examples of positive peace, but that's what I remember.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very much. So yeah, so this is like a very classical example of negative peace and positive peace when we're talking about war. And this was the context where it was first kind of developed by a guy named Johan Galtung, Norwegian sociologist who founded the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and he's kind of considered one of the pioneers of peace and conflict studies in general. So yeah, so negative peace is like just the end of the fighting, you know. So maybe everybody still hates each other, but at least the fighting's over. There's no violence. So negative peace is about the absence of something, and so this could be conflict. But in cases where we're not just talking about war, this could also be violence, but it could also be threat. So basically, there's something that seems threatening, whether it's conflict or violence, and our strategy is to like look at the thing that's threatening or look at the thing that's like attacking us and do whatever we need to do so that that thing is not there anymore, right? So if we look at some of these strategies like avoidance, right? Like separating yourself from the threat, right? Victory, like defending your boundaries, like these are ways of like resolving the conflict by like removing the threat. Positive peace, on the other hand, is so again, like the 2 sides working together, but it's also kind of like you engage with the other side to resolve the reasons why that conflict was there in the first place. So you're trying to find the roots of the conflict, or violence or threat, and resolve them. So I used the word engagement before, kind of to describe the different, a lot of the different strategies that were up here, like finding common ground, arbitration, negotiation, mediation. Like these are all ways of engaging with the thing that you find threatening, right? And so these are all strategies of positive peace. And so dialogue, for the most part, is framed as a strategy to achieve positive peace. Are there any questions or comments about this, or any clarifications that anybody would like to ask? Because this is the kind of like framework that we're going to be working with for the rest of our time together today. Nope. Also, if you do have a comment or something, or a contestation, please feel free to write it in the chat. So you're more than welcome.
Yeah, Kayla's also made note of positive peace as the absence of structures of violence.
Yeah. So when we're talking about violence in particular, like Galtung also developed this idea of like structural violence. So direct violence being kind of what we classically see as violence, like attack, assault, these kinds of things. So the absence of that is also like a negative peace. Whereas structural violence are ways that structures kind of oppress people in ways that aren't direct. So, for example, if we look at like the Black Lives Matter protests south of the border, a lot of people are talking about systemic racism. So that's a form that would be framed as a form of structural violence. Yes, so positive peace is often also framed as a way to like address structural violence, the kinds of structural violence that might lead to the conflict. So thank you, whoever brought that up. But that kind of goes down like another rabbit hole, which is, while important, I'm not sure if we'll have time to talk too much about that today. Okay, so these are the two different kinds of peace. We have different kinds of conflict, and if we look at the different different types that we talked about up here, like within families, value conflicts, religious conflict, you can see that like positive and negative peace are two strategies that can be used in all of these, right? Whether it's trying to like convince the other side that you're right, whether it's trying to create structures that allow everybody's needs to be taken into account, whether it's like framing other people's needs as illegitimate, for example, right? Like we look at we look at whites, like conversations about white supremacy down south, right? Like a lot of people are saying that certain of these needs and strategies aren't legitimate, so we limit them using like a negative peace strategy as well, right? So like in all these conflicts, there are positive and negative, like strategies for positive and negative peace. So we already kind of talked about this kind of like dialogue as compared to debate or mediation. Dialogue is is kind of the act of trying to generate mutual understanding in hopes that mutual understanding will help resolve other kinds of conflict. So when we get to like mediation or negotiation, we're arguing over interests or positions, whereas dialogue are also often talking about identities, you know, and values, how I see myself, how I see the other person, narratives, right? So dialogue is often the prep work that we do before kind of engaging with everything else like that. So we're talking a lot about dialogue as a way to generate mutual understanding, empathy, recognition, cooperation, but at a certain point, we run into a problem. The problem is, what if we don't want anything to do with the other side, right? So dialogue is being presented to us as a strategy for positive peace. But what if we don't actually want to engage? What if there are reasons for us not to engage with the other side? What does dialogue look like in this context? And if we look, for example, at different armed conflicts out there where two groups might be at each other's throats, and trying to bring them into dialogue with each other might seem like threatening and like an imposition, like if people aren't ready to see each other as something other than a threat, right? Like what does that look like? So here are 4 pictures of different groups and different people that, depending on who you are and what your background is, might be people that you might not want to engage with. So who are the people in these pictures? And like not just people, but also groups. Anyone can shout.
Well, I see ACAB, so that must be Antifa.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine on the top right, it's Vladimir Putin, so it must be like Russia versus America, right? Something like that, maybe? Or Russia and Ukraine?
Absolutely. That's kind of also like I don't know how Canadians kind of look at Putin, but like kind of in East Europe, like a lot of people see Putin as like this threat. You know, he's somebody that you contain. He's somebody that you subvert. He's not somebody that you talk with. In some cases. So what about the bottom 2?
Kadir is identifying ISIS on the bottom left.
Mm-hmm.
And the bottom right, is that the Proud Boys?
Yeah, so it's kind of like Proud Boys, or yeah. But like I don't know if they're actually the Proud Boys, but like those people, but like this kind of concern right now over, say, white supremacy, and kind of neo-Nazi groups within the States that might be using the imagery of the Confederate South. So Also, I recognize that like so in this class there might be a diversity of people who believe who are on different spots on the ideological spectrum. So these guys are different boogeymen for different people, right? So for example, for somebody who might be identify somebody on the left, Antifa might not be a threat. They might be the good guys, right? For somebody who thinks that the South was repressed and still hasn't gotten recognition, people who sport Confederate imagery, they might not be bad guys, right? For Russians who think that Russia needs to be defended against American imperialism, Putin is a good guy, right? But to other people, like for example, Ukrainians or people involved with racial issues, or you know, like these guys might not be the most friendliest. Like you might not want to see them at a dinner party, right? So what are the reasons why people might not want to engage these guys?
Fear, I think just fear of receiving some of the negative conflict coming your way for saying anything.
In what way? What kind of conflict heading your way?
I just think of violence potential.
Okay. So like even talking with these people might be a cause for violence. Yeah.
There's a lot happening in the chat right now. So
Oh my.
Isaiah is saying the ideologies might be tough. Radical ideas, says Genevieve. Past behaviors, says Christina. Tracy says they're violent extremists. Let's see, there's unpredictability, so it might be unpredictable. It's a response to political issues. I personally would say it might be a waste of time. That might hold me back from engaging.
Great. And why? Why are these some of the answers that you guys are giving? Like what makes these particular people potentially like too far gone to engage with? Like why like we had some mention like unpredictability, like radical ideas. Like what is it about those things in particular that makes it less attractive to engage?
Well, Isaiah says there might be underlying issues that might be personal. You might feel it's personal. Perception, reputation, says Tracy. So they have a reputation.
If I might add something, I don't know if it's been said, but you can't really reason with some of these people, right? Like white supremacists, they think that white people are superior to other ethnicities or other races, right? Whereas ISIS, they think that like their religion is the right one, and that all the other ones, are anyway. So yeah, maybe they can't be reasoned with.
Okay. So Sean is identified. She might not have any of these people in her circle. So she says access to be able to talk to some of them.
I'm being perfectly honest too, like when I'm looking at these specific individuals, like say the white supremacists, I'm making assumptions based on news media and other things. I haven't had any personal interaction with these specific people because everybody, even though they're part of the collective, they still have individual personalities and approachability, but I've locked myself probably into those ideas and concepts that they're not approachable.
Thank you.
Some people might just be uncomfortable starting a conversation with these people.
And like uncomfortable because of like fear of safety, uncomfortable because of like lack of experience? Like what kind of uncomfortability are we talking about here?
Probably like uncertainty, especially if they're not very familiar with what they're advocating for and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
So I saying there's maybe some generational causes, like we're taught to behave or to think a certain way, and it's passed down through generations. And Christine is identifying the role of social media and how we perceive others. And
Mhm.
Denis is all about, he's just straight fear. That's the word.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. I want to just write. This is actually a really good list. I want to write some of these down. So we had fear. I would say media narratives,
Yeah.
and this could be kind of like social media or other kinds of media. Lack of access or exposure.
Mhm.
So like access could also just be like, I just don't know where to find these people, you know, like I kind of have my own bubble, but also exposure could just be like, I just don't have experience, you know, like, so when we talk about, so it's actually, if we want to talk about like Antifa versus like people who might kind of like identify as white supremacists or like have kind of Confederate memorabilia, right? Like these, like for example, this kind of imagery might be actually very positive to people who are on the same side, or might be kind of comfortable, or kind of like it feels kind of like home, right? So those communities are kind of by their nature not connected to the other side, right? And each one kind of has their own kind of cultural language as well. Like if you want to say like freedom, right? Like freedom to kind of far left activists might be freedom from oppression, freedom from discrimination, right? Whereas freedom to people who might identify on the far right, it might be like freedom from, or like freedom to kind of like say what you want. Or so it's like freedom is actually also kind of has this complete other connotation and context. So even the language that we use can just be so different.
There's
So,
some more comments here in the chat that are worth noting.
Mhm.
So there, Tali says the reaction can sometimes be really intense, and so it seems that they don't hesitate to use violence.
Mhm.
There's possible language barriers. I mean, you've identified ISIS and maybe somebody who's a Putin supporter. Like I might have a difficult time if I don't speak Arabic or Russian. And I think it's interesting that you note the difference between language as in the language you speak in English, French, Russian, what have you, but also the kind of vocabulary and the kind of cultural currents that flow through those languages
Mhm.
that they're using.
Yes.
And the possibility that they wouldn't see me as a human being or as somebody worth dialoguing with, says Genevieve. And Evelyn's noticing the possibility for needing protection, I think is what she's getting at there.
Mhm. Great. Also, yeah, I think that the comments about language are also really, really interesting, because like if we're talking about kind of cultural conflict in the North American context, like it's really cool that actually St. Paul's is bilingual. But a lot of this kind of, but if we're talking about kind of the English media, like it's all the same language, but at the same time you do have these different cultural dialects. Whereas if people read French and English, sometimes the narratives might actually be completely different, like in different languages. So I know that for
Truth.
example, yeah, in Ukraine, depending on what language you read, if you don't have access to read one language or the other, you might only be fed narratives from one side or the other. So like that might be less of an issue in North America, but like in other parts, it can be huge.
We have
Great.
a
Some
lot
of
of
the other.
francophones in Quebec. We have a lot of francophones and Quebecers in this class. There's a pretty
Perfect.
strong contingent, so they would have a pretty good understanding of what it's like to consume media from either side of the river.
Can anybody give any examples of maybe one time when they found that reading something in French or in English presented completely different narratives about a kind of a controversial subject? Has anybody encountered that and wants to share?
I have a pretty simple example. from the viewpoint on separatism from Quebec and like Ontario. Sometimes Quebec might be more pro, whereas the English Ontario might be against usually.
Yep. Yeah, like especially like in the 80s, right? One thing that I wonder, and this is something I have no data on whatsoever, a lot of English language like media that kind of that kind of talks about the separatist movement in the 80s, it kind of frames it as like, oh, we almost made this mistake. Almost like, for example, when people were talking about the Scottish referendum of independence a few years ago, there was a lot of kind of attention paid again to, oh, Quebec had a referendum, but good thing they didn't do it, right? So there's no framing of that choice is possibly a good thing, right? And I don't know what the French media, how the French media presents it, you know, and I don't like that. That's something that's very curious to me. So I don't know.
I know because
Wonderful.
my
Please.
grandmother is a hardcore separatist.
Separatist, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, she yeah. When I talk to her and other people, the other Quebec separatist. I don't know. Yeah, I'm having trouble pronouncing it, but they're all saying like it was one of the worst things that could have happened. It was like the bitterest defeat ever, right? And there are a lot of videos on YouTube of the Prime Minister of Quebec at that time being like very emotional, right? And basically saying like, "Well, we'll get him next time, folks." And yeah, so yeah, it was a very bad thing that Quebec didn't manage to gain independence.
This is actually a really good example of positive and negative peace in a cultural context. So if we take the conflict here as being the conflict over whether Quebec separates or not, negative peace is just the referendum is voted no, and then English Canada doesn't think about it anymore. So for them, the threat is gone, but there's no engagement about engagement with the factors that led to that desire. So we're in a state of negative peace when it comes to Quebec separatism. And I think that I forget who was talking about like their grandmother and some of these other Quebecois citizens who might still kind of feel grievances or express grievances like or resentment. So the factors that have led to that resentment haven't been resolved. So if we want positive peace, then we need to do that, but that hasn't happened just yet. So thank you guys for sharing. So to go back to some of the reasons why people might not engage. Another thing that some people mentioned was feeling uncomfortable. I would also perhaps add unsafe. So another person said personal issues. And I'm not sure what this person was referring to, but examples of personal issues could be, for example, I could be traumatized, right? I might not be able to, like from a mental health perspective and a personal wellness perspective, engage with the other side because I've been traumatized, right? Or even kind of stepping back, I just might not have the skills, you know, like I might be triggered really easily because I've been I've maybe received like a lot of microaggressions in my life, you know, or maybe it's just hard for me to give the other side a chance to speak. Maybe that's just like something in my personality or something in my upbringing. So like these are also like there's a very wide range of personal issues that could be here. Assumptions of unreasonability. This is a huge one. So this is a narrative right here. So when we look at these guys, if we're on the other side, right? So let's take, for example, Antifa and the white supremacists, right? This is a really good example because they're kind of really opposite, right? People on one side might see the other side as radical, extreme. You can't talk to them. You can't touch them. But if these are the guys that are on your team, you might see them with more nuance, right? Well, oh, actually, within this group, there are lots of different mini groups. Like there's discussions. They're all not the same. Some are extreme, some are not extreme. But very often, when we look at the other side, we might assume that automatically that they're unreasonable and that we can't that we can't reach them or touch them. Another one that somebody said was personal experience. That might be like negative experiences with the other side, right? So looking at this list where we've come, when we started talking earlier about like for you, what is the connection between dialogue and needs and safety? A lot of the things that people were talking about were these positive peace factors of, you know, like feeling heard, creating safe environments, mutual listening. But we've kind of talked about here, like there are lots of reasons why we might not want any of that, you know? And so when we're talking about dialogue, and we're talking about like applying dialogue to the fields, no matter what field we find ourselves in, our families, our workplaces, or if you do go on to be like to work in mediation on a national and international level, you're always going to come across people who don't legitimize dialogue as a strategy for one of these reasons or more. And this is something that I've often come up against as a practitioner. And this is actually like one of the things that I'm interested in for my research project. So for my MRP or thesis. And so because this is something that like, when I think about Ukraine, for example, the stakes are so high that even talking with the other side for this, that, or the other reason, even if you do it, you might be seen as a traitor. People might attack you even from your own side, you know? So people who call themselves facilitators or say they're interested in dialogue, they themselves might become targets of attack by people who are so concerned with protecting their own side. So yeah, like for anyone who's interested in kind of pursuing dialogue on a more long-term basis, these are things that we're going to have to come up against. So yeah, we already talked about the reasons to choose against dialogue. But for you guys, I'm curious, like I just pulled these guys out of my hat, right? But for you, personally, with whom is it better perhaps not to dialogue? Get rid of this. And why?
I'll say, I'll say it's tough to have dialogue with somebody who hates you or who puts you in trouble, who is your enemy.
Do you feel like there's anybody out there who might hate you or who might be your enemy?
Yes. But this is like an example which I may like provide. Before I took the program of conflict studies, I thought the people in Burundi where I'm originally, the one who made my grandparent and my parent to run away from their country. So I thought they were my enemy or my parents' enemies or whatever. So I was like engaging with those people. It is sometimes tough, but now that I'm taking the program conflict the studies program, I know I kind of like coming to where I can start like engaging with those people instead of like staying away with them. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Is there anyone with whom it's better not to dialogue? Or do you have enemies?
Sorry, I missed a comment here from Kayla. Those who have already stuck to a single narrative, I think it's important to access your mental and emotional energy before choosing to engage in dialogue.
Yep.
I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Kayla.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is I think it's hard to engage in dialogue when it's only one-sided. So when someone kind of comes in with a single narrative that they've already committed to, I think there's no point in pushing further. I think it's just best to agree to disagree, because I think dialogue definitely needs two willing participants and cannot work if it's only one person coming in willing to be empathetic and to listen as well. So yeah.
Thank you, Kayla. Anyone else?
Sometimes it's not about not with whom is it not better not to dialogue, but is this the right time? Which I think is the other half of what Kayla was getting at. There's a timing issue.
Building on what Ellie was saying, I think if there's still active violence happening, we kind of need to wait for things to start to cool off before we can approach dialogue.
And this is something that's actually really interesting. I saw there was another comment in the chat, but if we could just wait for a second. We're talking about positive and negative types of peace. One thing that that I've seen, like in the field, is that sometimes dialogue practitioners and positive peace advocates, sometimes when they see people who are for negative peace, sometimes they get very frustrated. Like, oh, why are these people so small-minded that they only want negative peace? We need to engage, we need to talk, we need to find out these other people's needs. And that's also this very big debate in the field in terms of timing, right? So in situations of violence, maybe we need negative peace first. You know, we need to stop the violence, we need people to cool down, right? So like there's a very complicated relationship between these two things. And sometimes within at least the dialogue world, or the world of people are kind of practicing this, there can sometimes be the assumption that people who prefer negative peace might be bigoted or might be small-minded or single narrative, but sometimes they're very legitimate needs that need to be respected, needs for safety, needs for autonomy. And so on the question at the very beginning, what's the relationship between dialogue and needs? This is the other side of the coin. Like on the one side, we can use dialogue to try to address people's needs and to try to figure out people's needs. But on the other hand, sometimes dialogue, when pushed on people who aren't ready, when the timing is not right, dialogue itself becomes threatening because we're not ready. Maybe because we are so afraid of the other side that to engage in dialogue or to be forced to engage in dialogue could be traumatic. And so this is the dilemma kind of that's kind of at the core of what we're talking about today. So timing is a really good point. Thank you to whoever brought that up. Anything else?
Valentin has remarked, when you're still a stranger to that person, which I think is a really interesting reflection too.
Yeah, and this is like also really, really good because like when you know somebody, when there's context, again, you might be more willing to look at things with nuance. And so one of the some of the dynamics that people were talking about before was social media and narratives and media narratives. So a lot of, for example, these people or other people that might seem threatening to us because we don't know them, we might make those assumptions, right? And in some cases, those assumptions might be true, you know, but in other cases that they might not be true, you know. So it's very complicated when we don't know somebody because we can't anticipate what their needs are. We can't anticipate what their context is. And again, we're talking about cultural dialects. Sometimes when I come up to somebody who I don't know, I say dialogue, and what they hear is, you want me to betray my side. So I'm saying, let's dialogue, let's dialogue, let's dialogue, and all they're hearing is, you want me to betray my side. You want me to betray my community. So it's like, again, a part of getting like that, getting to know that stage of getting to know somebody is trying to figure out what are the controversial terms, like what are the fault lines in these cultural dialects where people kind of form these different communities with using language in different ways. So if a person is from one of those communities, I need to understand how they use language, right? Because without that knowledge, then I can go in there and start throwing words like that end up being like landmines and blow up the situation. And this is something that's involved in something called narrative work. So people who work with the narratives. So they're people who study the narratives of different groups that try to study how people use language. And this is like if dialogue is often the preparatory work for, say, negotiation or for mediation or these different kinds of things, narrative work is often the prep for dialogue. And I don't know if you guys have already spoken about that or if you will at some point, but there's a lot of really great work, interesting stuff out there on this. So yeah, what all this amounts to is resistance to dialogue, sometimes for very legitimate reasons. So as dialogue practitioners who go into a community and face legitimate resistance to dialogue, and this is also really, really touchy in cases where it's an international intervention. So for example, I go to like Turkey, you know, let's say, and there's like like ethnic Turks and ethnic Kurds. And I, as like a Canadian, and telling them you need to dialogue, then there can also be this kind of imperialistic element of like educated white person coming to tell all these other people like what to do, you know? And so that also kind of adds this kind of like other layer to things that can complicate stuff as well. So yeah, like I think my hope coming in was to talk about why there can be this resistance to dialogue, because again, often when we talk about dialogue, these are the things that people talk about at first: letting go, healing, different needs, openness, safety, safe spaces. Yeah, but sometimes dialogue is the other side of that. So negative peace is the desire to remove a threat, and the need for safety can be legitimate. And so the task, one of the big tasks for dialogue facilitators or even dialogue advocates, when you engage with people, you have to create a safe enough space for it. And this can be with your physical presence, body language. It can be with the words you use. It can be with the care that you choose the words. The fact that you put in the time ahead of time to learn their cultural dialect, to figure out what their narratives are, to address those narratives, the narratives that the other person has, versus the narratives that you have about them. So, and that's the task, and that's one of the biggest tasks. So, does dialogue always feel safe? No, because sometimes there are power structures or inequalities. There can be issues of health, and I include like health with safety, like physical health. Like for example, in Ukraine, this is an issue where if you actually talk about dialogue, you could in some places be assaulted because they think that you're with the enemy. Also, in the case of Russia and Ukraine, sometimes Russia promotes dialogue initiatives, but they're kind of like, I was in Ukraine 2 summers ago, and there was this big one about, you know, let this one like Russian television station connect with another Ukrainian television station because we need to talk. But it was also kind of for propaganda purposes, you know, to say that, oh, we Russians are the reasonable ones. It's the Ukrainians who don't want to talk. But the Ukrainians say we can't talk while we're in a position of inequality. And so dialogue also then can become a tool of the enemy. And so dialogue is used in bad faith in that context. And so that's also something that have to, and if we're working with a population that has been in that situation, then they might see us as having a different agenda. And sometimes we do have a different agenda, and it's good to be aware of that. So again, trauma can make dialogue not feel safe. The risk of losing. So for example, if you have a strong position, and if you're going to engage a dialogue, maybe you're going to have to give something up. And this is especially true in identity-based conflicts, where we're not just talking about resources or like where we're going to draw this piece of territory. We're also talking about our values. That's something we can't compromise on in a lot of ways. Our values, our sense of who we are. Risk of losing something like that, or losing reputation, losing prestige, losing political power, also that's a cost. And so for some people, to engage in dialogue would be to lose. And so that's also another reason why people might not want to touch it with a 6-foot pole. Interests, again, connected to the risk of losing. Maybe you have interests in keeping a conflict going, right? Does everybody here know what gaslighting is? Is this a word that people are familiar with?
Why don't you give us why don't you give us like a 20-second explanation of it, just in case?
Yeah, so gaslighting is basically, for example, let's say there's a relationship, and oh, is somebody saying something? Did I hear somebody?
No, that's a weird echo that Zoom sometimes does, I think.
Okay, cool. So gaslighting, let's say you're in a relationship, right? And your partner is acting passive aggressively or manipulatively, and they say, no, I'm not doing it. You're the one who's suspicious, right? So they're trying to make you doubt your story. They're trying to make you doubt your sanity, often as a kind of manipulation, either intentionally or unintentionally. For some people, being told that we need to dialogue is a form of gaslighting. They see it as gaslighting. They're saying, this is my truth, and I need to hold to my truth. If you're telling me that my truth is wrong, you're gaslighting me. And this is often the case of people with histories of abuse. If they've had abusers tell them that you're wrong, you need to look at the other side, then they might have a very legitimate reason to protect themselves from that. And so it's also a priority for dialogue facilitators to be aware of when their attempts to dialogue might be perceived as gaslighting. Also, sometimes dialogue facilitators are gaslighting, you know, like not everybody is has the, you know, pure intentions all the time. And so this is, again, this is a barrier that you can encounter sometimes like very legitimately. So another reason why people might not feel safe doing dialogue is because of legitimization. So it's like, oh, if I talk to the other side, I legitimize them. If I talk to the other side, I give them a platform. So this is actually something that's very common in kind of North American cultural conflict, like especially we're talking like liberals, conservatives, like pro-Trump, like anti-Trump, like these kinds of conflicts. Like often, like one criticism we hear is, I don't want them to speak because then we give them a platform. Often because we find that these people are threatening. And again, sometimes this is very legitimate, sometimes it's less legitimate, but it's hard to parse those out in the meantime. So these are ways that dialogue might not feel safe. So should you engage in dialogue at any given moment? If somebody's answer is yes, you know, we should always engage in dialogue, I haven't been doing my job today. Whether or not we engage in dialogue depends on our goals. Maybe we want negative peace, and maybe it's okay to want negative peace. Maybe it's too early to look for positive peace. Maybe it's too early to start dialogue. Maybe there is a way to create a safe enough space to do it. But maybe we just don't have the resources. You know, maybe we're not trained to do it properly. Maybe we ourselves are traumatized and we're the only ones who can do facilitation, but still we can't do it because we're triggered ourselves. So depending on our goals, you know, our goal might not be positive peace right now. I was at a lecture once. This one guy, he talked about what he called the East Asian peace. So East Asia, we're talking like China, Vietnam, Cambodia. This is one of the bloodiest battlefields of the 20th century, in the mid-century, Korea. But then in the 80s, almost nobody started dying. It's almost as if the Middle East just like found peace, you know, like that's the scale, you know, like it was bloodier in East Asia than it was in the Middle East. But in the 80s, it changed everything. And what they say is that there's a very strong negative peace that people create, like all the different governments created. It's not a positive peace, and so it's not ideal, but less people are dying, you know? And maybe if we tried to dismantle that negative peace to try to create positive peace, maybe wars would start again, you know? So every situation is really different. And should you engage in dialogue or should you promote positive peace? It depends on your goals. And I think that we have a duty to be aware of our goals. It also depends on your definition of success. So maybe your definition of success isn't, you know, generate mutual understanding and pixie dust and unicorns and like all this stuff, right? Maybe your definition of success is just, you know, be in a room with the other person and that's it. You know, maybe dialogue can come later and that's okay. It also depends on your long-term needs. Again, this comes down to safety, mental health, wellness, especially like we were talking about like workplace relationships or familial relationships. There can often be histories of abuse or histories of manipulation. Sometimes it's not even like one person oppressing the other. It can be like both parties not taking into account each other's needs. And maybe it's better to have some time apart. sometimes, and that's a form of negative peace. That's okay. And maybe you need to do some work on yourself before engaging in dialogue because you're so angry perhaps, or like there's a history of resentment or abuse on your side or the other side. So again, it depends on your long-term needs. And your immediate needs are also important. So again, if you're triggered by something, that's legitimate. And I think there can be this also kind of culture within dialogue practitioners that tries to kind of demonize our immediate needs. Like, oh, I don't want to, but I should do this. You know, like we have a right to listen to ourselves and we have a right to be listened to. You know, it's not always about just listening to the other person. Like we are just as human as the other side. And if there are issues, and if we feel our immediate needs are not being met, then that's something that we need to look into. It also depends on your context. So again, I was talking about the Russian-Ukrainian context because there's this huge power structure and this power imbalance. Dialogue is going to be seen as something different than dialogue between, say, the Flemish and the French-speaking parts of Belgium, where there's more or less like political equality. So yeah, I just want to conclude by recommending a documentary. I'll be sending the link to Natalie.
It's actually already up. It's already up in Brightspace.
Perfect. So this is a documentary called White Right, Meeting the Enemy. It produced and directed, sorry, yes, did you have some? Great. So produced and starring a filmmaker named Dia Khan. And she is a Muslim woman of color from Britain. And she wanted to engage with white supremacists in the States post 2016. So she was literally like interviewing some of America's like highest profile white supremacists. She was even, if you guys remember what happened in Charlottesville a few years ago, the Unite the Right rally, she was there with the white supremacists filming like all this stuff, you know, and like capturing their stories. And she was wondering what happens when these men, and many of them are men, some of them are women, but many of them are men for a variety of reasons. What happens when they're confronted with a woman of color, a Muslim woman of color, who wants to speak to them and learn their stories? So it's a very powerful film, but also it's an example of a person who does dialogue, who in the process of working with a very dangerous context, creates spaces that are safe enough for her and for the other side. So we were talking about like a lot of these reasons why dialogue doesn't feel safe. We were talking about these reasons about with whom it's better not to dialogue, or what about timing. And this is an example of a person who made that for herself, created a safe enough space to do this. But I don't want to kind of elevate her as a model because, for example, she had a budget. She had maybe her own emotional resources. She perhaps was very confident in her abilities, you know? So I don't want to say, you know, be like Dia Khan. Although if you want to, and if you want to be like trained to become like that, that's amazing. We need more people like her, but it's like it wouldn't be fair to expect everybody to be like her. So yeah, I very much recommend this. Another film that I recommend, it's not on Brightspace and it's not free. You have to rent it. It's one called Reunion. This was a documentary that got me inspired with the dialogue process. So it was done by a group called the Nansen Center for Peace and Dialogue. And so they do different dialogues between groups who are either pre-war or post-war. So they were doing a lot of dialogues in the Balkans. So for example, between Bosnians, Croats, Serbs, also between Serbs and Albanians in Kosovo. And it actually shows a dialogue session, like a dialogue weekend, where like Kosovar Serbs and Kosovar Albanians were brought in a room and they were to speak to each other and to share their stories with each other. So I can also send a link, but this one you have to pay like $3 to watch it or something like that, but it's really worth it. And it's another example of, whereas with Dia Khan, it's one woman who creates a space for herself. For this one, this is more of an official dialogue with an organization, with a trained facilitator who's neutral between two sides. So these are two completely different contexts of dialogue, but just very good resources that I very much recommend if you're interested in kind of exploring these issues more. So if we had time, which I actually have to duck out pretty soon. It would have been interesting to talk about why might Diacon feel like it's important to dialogue with white supremacists, because we spent this class a lot talking about why we might not feel it's important, right? And I think both paths are legitimate with their own reasons. And again, why might others feel it's important not to dialogue with them? So maybe that can just be food for thought on your own. And again, it would have been great to have discussion times to talk about your own contexts. What does dialogue look like in your families, in your workplaces, at school? Who needs to be engaged with? What needs to be resisted or avoided? What does it mean to take your needs into account? Are there cases where we're not taking our needs into account, and is that dangerous? So again, food for thought for another time. So I just want to also make a couple announcements. If you're interested in this kind of stuff more, there's different kinds of events online, both in Ottawa and internationally. So the first, I have a project that's called Kitchen Talks, and we meet twice a month, and we discuss controversial topics. So it's a facilitated dialogue setup, where if people are really disagreeing with each other, we have different activities, different exercises to ask each other questions to learn more. So topics we talked about have been like vaccination, or Donald Trump's legacy, or religion in the public sphere. So I'll send along links if you guys want to try this out to participate. I'm more than happy for that. Also, if you're interested in trying facilitation or kind of testing out being able to facilitate some kind of dialogue yourself, we can also possibly set up some kind of time or training for that. And that would be something I'd be interested in if you guys are interested in that. The next, also, I run workshops occasionally on particular dialogue techniques. So one thing that somebody mentioned previously was what happens when the other side doesn't want to dialogue? What does it mean to kind of dialogue one-sidedly? Like, is that even possible? So there are actually lots of different techniques that people use to try to, for example, encourage dialogue with somebody. Like, for example, there's a technique called nonviolent communication. And this is a technique that people use to help the other person feel seen. Because maybe a person doesn't want to do dialogue because they don't feel seen or because they feel threatened. And so this is a technique to try to make your needs visible in non-manipulative ways, but also help the other people's needs feel genuinely seen. And sometimes when you do that, you generate that safe space between you and the other person, and that person becomes willing to dialogue. So I'm running a workshop this Friday called How to Disagree Without the Disaster. And it's about a technique called double crux. And you guys are more than welcome to sign up and join. I can leave the link to the Eventbrite. It's for free. So we're hoping to do different workshops on different techniques to help in situations like that. The other one, the group that trained me, the Nansen Center for Peace and Dialogue in Norway, they're the ones who did the documentary about the dialogues in Kosovo. They're doing an online dialogue training workshop. It's 4 days in March. And it's mostly on the weekend. And there's a discount for students, so it's 50 euros, normally 200 euros for the 4 days. And they're really great. And it's about facilitation. So, and they're like, one of their facilitators has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize like a number of times. So I can't recommend them highly enough. So I will send these links. And maybe also I can leave my contact information with Natalie. So if you guys want to get in touch about anything that we talked about today, or if you're interested in getting more involved in dialogue projects in Ottawa or abroad, yeah, I'm very willing to speak to you guys, and yeah, we can talk.
Yeah. Josh, if you want to send me that list of resources and your contact information, I will send that by email or post it in Brightspace or something so that everybody has access to all of those resources. Also, don't forget you folks are responsible for designing and facilitating your own dialogue in the last few weeks of class. So there might be some benefit to exploring some of these resources that Josh is suggesting to inspire how you're going to go about your final project there. So maybe approaching Josh as a group, or as sending a representative or two of your group to go and chat with Josh, or follow some of these links that he's offering to see what there is that might be useful to give a try in our group together. So does anybody have any final questions for just the last couple of minutes for Josh there? He's not going to stay with us too much longer. He's got to run. So if you have quick ones, that would be fine. If you have more, I'd be happy to forward them on to Josh or you can ask him yourself, like whatever is going to work for us to get those questions answered. I'm volunteering you, Josh, that people might have questions, and so he might answer them. But any quick questions, maybe related to resources or anything?
Also, I will send Natalie a PDF of these slides if you're interested in that. So,
very cool.
I had a quick question, if you can hear me.
Yes.
Who is this?
That's Kayla.
Kayla.
Kayla. Hello, Kayla.
Yeah, you just mentioned that you're currently studying. I was just wondering kind of like what your field is and just that whole, yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
I think it was
Sorry,
about your it's okay. I think it was about you being a practitioner in dialogue. So if I'm wrong, Kayla, please correct me. But it was more about like maybe how you find your gigs. What organizations do you work with? Like what's that all about?
So I have a couple different pots on the stove. So I create some of my own projects. So Kitchen Talks is a project that I created, and the workshops are also things that I run myself. I work with a collective in Russia, and we do different kinds of events and workshops. So I do things with them. In Ottawa, since I've been here, I started doing them on my own. But since then, there's also a couple organizations that have been in touch that maybe want to do team ups for that. In Ukraine, I work with a research center, an NGO, and so we've done dialogue as a way to help integrate IDPs, so internally displaced persons from the war. So using dialogue as a way to kind of try to help people gain access to certain social services and to help with anti-discrimination stuff. So just a lot of different things. Some are kind of official, but like some things I just do kind of like to normalize dialogue culture, as well as to raise awareness of different techniques and different approaches. So also like today's guest lecture, so I'm very happy and grateful for Natalie for inviting me.
Yeah, that was wicked. So I'm going to cut it off here. If you have more questions, because I know you need to go, I don't want to abuse your time, because you gave us a phenomenal introduction into the work that you do. And I'm pretty aware that it was an introduction, that it goes deep, that there's so much work that just Sacreuse, like, it really digs at a lot of the really important things. So really big thank you. And I'll keep an eye out for some resources to share with the students. And there's so many thank yous happening in the chat right now. So everybody seems very appreciative of what you brought today. It's quite different from the mishmash of weirdo physics sort of dialogue theory that they've been getting for the last few weeks. So I'm sure they were really happy to see exactly how this stuff, like what it actually means for practice. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah. I guess as a takeaway, I just want to reaffirm that dialogue is one tool in the toolbox that works in some situations and not in others. And the more we understand why it works somewhere and why, the better we'll be able to apply it when it's needed. So thank you guys very much for your time.
Excellent.
And hopefully we'll be in touch.
Okay, thanks, Josh.
Thank you. Are you the organizer now, or am I still the organizer?
When you sign off, it's going to assign it to somebody, maybe me. I don't know. We'll see.
Okay.
I'm sure it'll be fine.
Okay.
Am I the host? Who's the host?
Let me click on this button. You are the host again. Okay, thanks guys.
Okay, thank you.
Right, call me, be in touch. It's COVID, and I need friends. Have a good one.